All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. It's been a couple of weeks since we released a new episode. So we're going to pick up where we left off on High Risers by Ben Austen. We're on the bottom of page 84. Kelvin Cannon. The reality on the ground in Cabrini Green, especially for young guys like Kelvin Cannon, just entering their teens, seemed less than dreamy. The Blackstone Rangers, the Southside gang headed by Jeff Ford, were then undertaking a citywide recruitment drive that included the near North Side. Students leaving Cooley or Waller High would find a group of Blackstone Rangers with bats waiting for them outside. Quote, "What do you represent?" End quote, they'd ask menacingly. Quote, "What's your ride?" End quote. There were guys all over the streets near Cabrini wearing red berets and demanding to know what gang boys were in. The options were to say the Stones or to receive a beatdown, though occasionally you get lucky, a teacher or a cop would appear, or the recruiter knew your older brother and would tell you under his breath to run. On a summer day in 1976, when Kelvin was 13, he and his friends were playing strikeout against their high-rise, the strike zone, a spray-painted box on the sand-colored wall of 714 West Division. Kelvin was in the outfield. A boy named Beaky was pitching. Then 5 guys stepped between Binky and the batter. They were older, out of high school. By then, the Blackstone Rangers had taken control of most of the whites at Cabrini Green, and now they were coming for Kelvin's home. One of the guys pressed his shoulder against Binky's shoulder, their cheeks nearly touching, as the two of them turned together in the stomach-knotting slow dance preceding a fight. The older boy muttered incitements in Binky's ear. "You think you can beat me?" He pushed Binky hard, as if to begin, but then engaged again, leading him in another series of turns. It was all ponderous precursor to the violence, as if the young men were searching for whatsoever would rouse him to action. It came when Binky tried to resume the game, stepping away to throw the rubber ball at the painted target. The Blackstone Ranger threw 2 quick blows to the pitcher's face, then all was movement. The other 4 Stones with him piled on the punches and kicks. Kelvin and his friends rushed to help. They outnumbered the Stones, and they found themselves outboxing them as well. That's when one of the Rangers reached into his waistband, and everything went still. The pistol he pulled out was square-framed and glinted in the light. He held it to Binky's face. Quote, "Ought to blow your motherfucking head off," end quote. He raised the gun and cracked his butt against Binky's temple. The boys from 714 West Division scattered. When they reassembled later that night in the lobby of their building, they were still jumpy with adrenaline. Kelvin and his friends replayed every detail of the brawl, reenacting the moments that words alone couldn't capture. They'd held their own against 20-year-olds. They weren't hooked up with any gang, but they weren't pushovers. For most of their lives, they teamed up against other buildings for sports or snowball fights. 3 or 4 of them would head off together to the store to steal candy. Quote, 714 was the best in sports there was, so it wasn't a surprise to us that we came out on top in fighting too, end quote, Kelvin would say. He was then lollipop framed with the long, willowy body and a big round head of straightened hair. His dewy eyes and wide, fixed grin didn't project menace, but there was little that he feared. Excuse me. He would gladly defend his building. Quote, "Bear arms," end quote, was how the group of them put it. Some of their older brothers were back from Vietnam, and the boys had access to guns. Really, they only wanted to show that they had guns just like the Stones had guns. They weren't going out there like them, terrorizing people. They weren't planning to shoot. But over the next months, they did have gunfights with the Stones, and they took them on fist to fist too. They managed to push the Stones back to Cedric Street, near the Marshall Field Garden Apartments. The Blackstone Rangers were forced out of most of Cabrini Green. Kelvin liked to say that their resistance changed the course of history at the housing project forever. While they'd overcome the Rangers, the guys from 714 West Division started skirmishing with the boys from the surrounding high-rises. The groups of friends from those buildings had banded together in the same way. They bore arms to keep other teams from storming their entranceways. Guys from 660 West Division or 1230 North Larrabee might come over to 714, mess with their girls, disrespect them. A punch would be thrown, and it demanded a response. If they pushed up on you, you went to their building to body slam one of them. One day, a bunch of boys from 630 West Evergreen snuck into Kelvin's building and trapped him on the ramp. They came at Kelvin from the stairwells on either side of him. Kelvin figured it better to deal with half of the boys than let the entire group wail on him, so he ran toward one of the stairwells. Several boys grabbed him and tried to pull him down the stairs. Kelvin swung wildly. One of the guys shouted, quote, "I got him," end quote, but Kelvin landed a blow to his face. Then Kelvin's friends from his building heard the hollering and came to help, and the intruders fled. Those boys from 630 West Evergreen called themselves the Insanes. In another surrounding high-rise, there were the Imperial Pimps, and in two of the Reds, there were the Outlaws and Renegades. Even 1230 North Burling, mostly neutral when it came to fighting, had the Black Pearls. Kelvin and his buddies in 714 West Division decided they were the CCs for Chocolate City. To them, that sounded cool. But they started to think the name too soft. Quote, "We wanted to sound as hard as everyone else," end quote, Kelvin said. They changed from Chocolate City to Imperial Gangsters. The fall of that same year, not long after the start of school, the leader of the gangster disciples at Cabrini Green summoned all these different Pee-wee gangsters from the white high-rises. They were told to meet after class one day at 3:30 behind their middle school in the park named for President Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. 60 of them gathered there, the boys from each building huddled in their different cliques. Then Bo John arrived, flanked by two of his lieutenants. His real name was Cedric Matabia, and he was 20 and recently out of the penitentiary. He wore a sleeveless t-shirt that showed off just how much he bulked up in prison, and from his neck hung a large, gold six-pointed star, the emblem of the disciples. Every kid there knew about Bo John. He lived in the Whites, too, and some of the boys had played on big wheels with his younger brothers. One of Kelvin's older brothers ran with the disciples. He'd recently been violated by the gang, beaten with bats for shooting heroin. Kelvin accepted that his brother deserved the sanctioned punishment since he'd broken the gang's bylaws about drug use. Kelvin was willing to hear Bo John out. Quote, "I call it for the folks over here," end quote, Bo John began by way of introduction. He praised the guys from 714 West Division for fending off the Blackstone Rangers. He said it took courage to take on grown-ups. Kelvin and his friends blushed with the thrill of the important man's attention. But then the disciples' leader scolded the lot of them for tearing up the community. Quote, "Y'all acting just like the Stones, battling one another," end quote. He said they'd all grown up in the Greens. He wanted them to imagine how strong they'd be if they didn't waste their energies beating up on one another. Other gangs were corrupt, he told them, but the disciples fought for what was right. They lived by a code, by rules. They didn't jump on people for no reason, and they battled heads up. Everyone in front of him had already proven himself worthy of being a GD. Quote, "You all might as well ride together," end quote, Bo John said. Quote, "I like y'all to rise up under me," end quote. There was nothing Kelvin loved so much as a gangster movie. After he saw Once Upon a Time in America a few years later, he and his crew started calling each other by the characters' names: Noodles, Max, Patsy. Kelvin became Big Frank, though mostly he was just Cannon, which people assume was not his real name, but a nickname he'd earned through some display of prejudiced violence. One of his all-time favorite movies was The Warriors. When he first watched it at the McVickers Theater in the Loop, he realized Bo John was just like the gang leader at the start of the movie, the one who preaches unity to all of New York's street gangs, right before he gets shot, telling them that the future is theirs. If they can count, they have strength in numbers. They needed only to overcome their divisions, to join together, talking about, quote, "Can you dig it?" end quote. That's how Bo John had talked to them behind Schiller School, that the gangster disciples could take over all of Cabrini Green, the row houses, the Whites, the Reds along Larrabee, known as the Boulevard, and those on the southern edge of the development as well, the Wild End. All they had to do was follow him. It was a message most of the middle schoolers were eager to hear. By then, Jesse White had been tapped by George Dunn to run the Illinois General Assembly. The campaign posters showed White in his Cubs and paratrooper uniforms, strong-jawed and stately. Cabrini Green offered a solid block of Democratic machine votes, and White won the election. He continued to teach at Schiller and attend every Tumblr's performance, hundreds of them each year. But with regular trips to Springfield, he had to cut back on his other extracurriculars at Cabrini Green. Kelvin thought sometimes that White's start in the legislature marked the turning point for Cabrini Green. Quote, Mr. White was a blessing from God to us here, end quote, Kelvin would say. Quote, but he had to go on to politics and help more people. That's when everything went bad. We didn't have nothing else to do. Maybe more of us would have stayed in school if Mr. White had remained more involved. Maybe a lot of people wouldn't have gone to jail or been killed, end quote. For Kelvin and many others, it felt like they'd lost another father. And I think one of the things that stands out there is, or stands out in the section that we read, is just all the obstacles that are in the way of people who live in disenfranchised and impoverished communities, the obstacles that have historically been in the way, specifically for people living in public housing, and why so many people get caught into those obstacles. As you've seen here, Kelvin, the first time Kelvin went to have a gun or to get a gun, possess a gun, was for protection. The fight that Kelvin was in that led to him and his friends sort of forming this gang or forming this set for protection, it wasn't something that they initiated, but it was something that they took part in to protect themselves and to keep themselves safe. And I think that that's something that is not highlighted enough, is how many people enter into these lifestyles or end up in the system based off making decisions for self-preservation. And a lot of times self-preservation and survival in these type of communities comes before thinking about your future, or comes before education, or comes before even morality. And a lot of times, if you've never been in the type of situations where survival is something that you're forced to have to grapple with, you don't understand the things you would or wouldn't do in an effort to achieve that survival. Okay, let's keep reading. Reginald Blackman, one of Kelvin's best friends, would later say that Bo John was the first man who ever showed him love. Kelvin saw Bo John more as a big brother. His own father had left for the South Side. His brothers were doing their own thing. He was the oldest male in his apartment with his mother and younger siblings. Kelvin felt it was time for him to grow up. Quote, at Cabrini Green, you didn't have to wait until you were 18 to be a man, end quote, he'd say. Quote, you could be a man at 12 or 13, end quote. Bo John gave them money each week. That was better than turning flips with Mr. White. And truth be told, by the time Kenan and his friends were 13, 14, it was no longer cool to hang with Mr. White. They didn't want to be seen wearing the white suspenders and red tams of the tumbling team. Of the hundreds of Boy Scouts under Jesse White, the older brother of Reginald and William, Richard, was the only one of any of them knew who tried for Eagle. Of the hundreds of Boy Scouts under Jesse White, the older brother of Reginald and William, Richard, was the only one any of them knew who tried for Eagle. Like Dolores Wilson's oldest son, Chi-Chi, Richard ventured out of the neighborhood to Lane Tech, the prestigious magnet high school a bus ride north. On the mornings when his mother couldn't muster the bus fare, Richard was assisted by the drunks along Halstead, who pulled their nickels to get him to school. He stayed clear of the gangs and went to college in Southern Illinois, later becoming a lawyer and then an educator at a public high school on the South Side. Quote, I adopted Jesse White's belief, end quote, Richard would say. Quote, I don't listen to what's not possible, end quote. Richard said that his little brothers and Kelvin were wonderful, bright-eyed boys, athletes, math whizzes, goofs around girls. Maybe they buzzed on reefer or cheap wine, but they didn't know anything about cocaine or heroin. These boys from 714 West Division were still in middle school. Then all of a sudden, Richard didn't recognize them. They transformed. Just a few years earlier, they believed in witches haunting the Ogden Avenue Bridge. Adults didn't even bother with that tall tale anymore. By comparison, a spectral gypsy no longer seemed like much of a threat. Cannon and the other young gangbangers now imagined that they were the ones to be feared at Cabrini. And Cannon believed that it was through such fear that he, too, could provide a little bit of order to the chaos of life there. And that brings us to the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. And we only read a little bit. It was only a few more paragraphs since my last reflection. But I think that what stands out from those paragraphs is just the speed at which life goes for people in these communities and how quickly people are forced to grow up in these situations, in these communities. And they're not given the same luxuries to be kids or to be children as people who grow up in upper middle class or in high class communities. The decisions that these in middle school, they're making decisions that are life and death decisions. They're making decisions that will have impacts on their life for 5, 10, 20 years down the line. And most middle schoolers aren't doing those things. Most high schoolers aren't doing those things, until maybe you're a senior in high school and you're starting to pick what colleges and things like that you're going to. But for these young men, for these young people that are in these type of situations and these type of living conditions, there are life and death decisions being made very early on. Chapter 5. The mayor's pied-a-terre? I don't know if I'm saying that right. Dolores Wilson. In her job with the Department of Water Management, Dolores Wilson helped process the paychecks for the employees of the 2 pumping stations. She filed, typed, and sorted the mail. She answered the phones for 3 purification labs and the head of microscopy. She was considered a good worker, at one point the department's employee of the year. Yet even with all her responsibilities, Dolores often found herself with little to do. This was, after all, a patronage job under Chicago's democratic machine. One afternoon, she knocked on her boss's office door. Would it be okay if she read during the downtimes? It was fine as long as she didn't look too conspicuous. She shouldn't prop her feet up on the desk or anything like that. So Dolores demurely plowed through romances and inexpensive paperbacks. She devoured the Mandingo series about slavery and sex on an Alabama plantation. She finished one long Russian novel after another. Dolores tended to worry herself sick over the suffering of others, even animals. Quote, "It's like a phobia," end quote, she would confide. If she saw a lion catch a zebra on television, the zebra's cries would stay with her for days. At Holy Family, her church at Cabrini Green, she prayed out loud for people in Africa and Siberia. She prayed for the owners of pit bulls to have a clean heart, a kind heart, and not to enter their pets in fights. She goed weeks without reading the newspaper because she couldn't handle stories of people in Vietnam, Cambodia, or wherever else they were being bombed and gassed and massacred. Hubert told the children not to share bad news with their mother, and sometimes she learned about a death months after it occurred. She was haunted especially by a line she read in Dostoevsky about a society being judged by its prisons. Kenny, her youngest, was once sent to the Audi home, the city's juvenile detention center. It was winter, and the guards made the boys strip down and shower, lining them up wet and naked by the open windows for hours as their bodies convulsed from the cold. She couldn't fathom why one human being would do that to another one. Lately, she'd been imagining the prisoners who were trapped in solitary confinement. She realized that at any moment, in some godforsaken penitentiary, there were people shut inside cramped boxes without windows or contact with others. She learned that the inmates might be placed in the, quote, hold, end quote, for a week at a time. Were they allowed visitors? Did they receive letters? Were they denied every kindness? Along with the organist at Holy Family, Gloria Johnson, Dolores decided to start a pen pal program for the incarcerated. Jesse Jackson had moved on from Operation Breadbasket, founding his own Chicago-based organization, Operation Push, for People United to Save Humanity. From the Push folks, Dolores received a list of 25 inmates, and she wrote each of them, explaining who she was and what she was doing, promising that she wasn't the warden trying to trick them into revealing information. She then reached out to fellow church members and neighbors, finding a letter writer for every prisoner. Gloria took a guy named Jerome, who was serving a long sentence. Dolores' daughter Debbie wrote another prisoner. For herself, Dolores picked a man named Maurice Slaughter. Quote, "With a name like that, I figured he could use a friend," end quote, she said. Those first 25 incarcerated men told others about her. Soon Dolores was receiving letters from prisons all over Illinois and then throughout the country, with the number of pen pals reaching into the hundreds. Once, a man from Stateville, the penitentiary less than an hour outside of Chicago, called Collect to ask Dolores if she would stay on the phone and listen to one song with him on the radio. Before long, she was jumping into Gloria's rickety Volkswagen first thing on Saturdays. In Chicago, being sent, quote, downstate, end quote, meant going to prison, and the two of them would drive to the different Illinois towns that housed the penitentiaries: Dixon, Joliet, Menard, Pontiac. In wintertime, they'd wear coats and boots In wintertime, they'd wear their coats and boots the entire ride since the heat in the Volkswagen didn't work. During visiting hours, they talked with the inmates, and when possible, they brought with them the prisoners as families. They had cards printed up calling themselves, quote, prison problem consultants, end quote. They showed the cards to the guards with formality, and because they were, quote, consultants, end quote, they no longer were limited to meeting with just one inmate on each trip. The more the men told Dolores about their experiences in prison, the more distressed she became. Guards hit them with chains and handcuffed them to their cells in standing positions. The inmates were forced to sleep on concrete floors. Many of the black inmates had turned to Islam in prison, and they weren't allowed to worship. Once, she arrived when the prison was on lockdown. The men rattled their metal cups against the bars as the guards blasted them with water from fire hoses. Dolores now thought about the prisons nonstop, images of deprivation and torture coming to her as she was falling asleep or riding the bus to her job. She cursed the guards and the wardens, the judges and the lawyers, the police, and whoever else determined the fate of these men. She started writing letters to the Chicago newspapers, composing them on her lunch breaks. Writing about the Menard 38, inmates who barricaded themselves in the commissary in 1973, holding a guard hostage, she explained that the men were trying to bring attention to the inhumane conditions at their penitentiary. She argued that wardens and guards were effectively sentencing prisoners a second time by condemning them to physical pain. With no effort to rehabilitate them, the incarcerated were stripped of their dignity. They were being taught to hate and distrust, dooming them before any release back into society. Quote, "We, the so-called intelligent and educated, are allowing our men to be made into animals because they're being treated as such," end quote. She wrote in a letter published in The Defender, quote, "We are the hopeless because none are so blind as those who refuse to see and act against injustice," end quote. She published so many letters in the paper that The Defender gave her a byline, calling her a, quote, prison correspondent, end quote. The newspaper described her as a full-time stenographer, a wife, a mother, and a grandmother who was using her non-existent, quote, spare, end quote, time to communicate with those in Illinois prisons. The accompanying photograph showed her at 44 with cornrowed hair, heavily arched brows, and large hoop earrings. It's her eyes, though, that stand out the most. They look past the photographer, the brown in the irises dancing with the private joke and something like judgment. One of the prisoners got a hold of the article and painted a portrait for Dolores based on the photograph, presenting it to her the next time she visited. As overprotective as Hubert was, he didn't feel jealous of his wife spending her precious time on these lonely, incarcerated men. Gloria even ended up marrying her pen pal, saying she'd wait the 20 years for Jerome to get out. Hubert was charitable in his own right. Dolores came home once to find him feeding a homeless man at their kitchen table. What Hubert didn't like about the prison work was that the men were criminals. They made their beds, he'd tell Dolores, let them lie in it. They didn't deserve her empathy. He and Dolores would bicker about it, but the arguments never lasted. They'd been married for more than 25 years, the majority of their lives. They threw a silver anniversary party at St. Joseph's, inviting all their friends and relatives. They went boating together, horseback riding, And each year, Dolores and Hubert coordinated their vacation days so they could go to Jamaica during the cheaper off-season. 13 hurricane seasons in a row, they made the trip, always booking a room in the same Holiday Inn. Hubert was promoted to an assistant head janitor position at Cabrini Green, and Dolores, upon hearing the news, cried. The new job was in a different section of the housing complex, the Whites, and they would have to move across Division Street into 1230 North Burling. Dolores didn't want to go. She had everything in their 1117 North Cleveland apartment exactly how she liked it. All the interior decorating was in place. She knew every neighbor. Quote, "It isn't where you live, it's how you live," end quote, Dolores would say. Quote, "I can move into one of these high-rises overlooking the lake and everything. Until a part of me is in there, it's just an apartment. A home isn't a home until you've been in it a while," end quote. On the morning of the move, as a passive protest, Dolores refused to help, leaving early for the water department. That was fine with Hubert. He carried their belongings north of Division Street and up to the 14th floor of the Burling high-rise. He unpacked, putting each item in its proper place. He hung his wife's yellow curtains. He outfitted the kitchen with an upright freezer, an electric dishwasher, and a washer and dryer, all the appliances in the same color of harvest gold. In the bathroom, he painted the walls peach with the star pattern, so it almost looked like wallpaper, and installed a shower door with the swan design. The new apartment was bigger, 4 bedrooms instead of 3, and it had a bathroom and a half. When Dolores returned from work to the unfamiliar surroundings, she couldn't help but like what she saw. Neighbors she didn't know were inside the apartment too, admiring the setup. Dolores asked Hubert what all these people were doing there. He said they were envious, quote, "because we're more fortunate than they are," end quote. Quote, "How am I more fortunate?" end quote, Dolores asked, unable to stop smiling. And that brings us to a changing of the themes in the chapter. And that brings us to about our 30-minute mark. So we'll end this chapter here, or end this episode here. What stands out from the first part of the chapter that we just read, to me, is Dolores' empathy for the conditions that these men were living in these prisons. And I think that's something that is very important for the causes that the May 30th Alliance advocates for, which is an end to police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Because one of the things that often is not spoken about the prison industrial complex and about mass incarceration is how many people, the amount of people who leave out of prisons in worse psychological conditions than they were when they went in, worse physical conditions than they were when they went in, worse mental and emotional conditions than they were when they went in. And I think that is something that has to be highlighted, because it makes you understand why recidivism is at such a high rate, why so many people get out of prison and end up right back in prison. It's because you go into these prisons and you become institutionalized. You become conditioned to be prisoners. You become conditioned to be what the society deems to be as criminals. The type of, it's, to me, one of the best ways to put it is, if you have a person who is exhibiting characteristics that are against what is we deem to be the betterment of society, why would you take that person and put them around a bunch of other people who exhibit those same characteristics? Why would you take that person and then dehumanize that person and ostracize that person? And when you think about it in those sort of an aspect, and when you think about how many people are in prison who are not guilty of what they are in prison for, when you think about how many people are in prison and are being over sentenced for what they are in prison for, when you think about how many people are in prison and what they are in prison for, the time that they are being or the sentence that they have been given is not just compared to what the crime that they have been convicted for, or even people who have been unlawfully convicted, where the state's attorney or the police have, whether this person was innocent or guilty, they have manipulated the justice system to get this person to be in prison. When you take all of those things into consideration as well, you don't just look at it as, well, he did the crime, so you need to do the time. When you look at it in a individual aspect, you begin to understand some of the things that are are just overtly wrong about the prison industrial complex, that are overtly wrong about mass incarceration. And I believe it says more about us as a society who find ways to be desensitized and who have found ways to normalize locking people in cages than it does in actuality say about these people who are locked in cages. And so I would encourage anybody who is maybe listening to this episode and this is the first time you listen to a Rockford reading to please go back and listen to the previous episodes that we have. If you're listening to this and it's future episodes out, I would encourage you to please go and listen to those future episodes. I want to thank everybody for being patient while we were on somewhat of a hiatus here. And the goal is to not have another one of those hiatuses for a while. So we will be back tomorrow with a new episode of Rockford Reading Daily. And we'll continue reading High Risers by Ben Austen. Share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on.